Hey, today's demo is going to be about how I take a sketch, which I've done on tracing paper. This is the kind of paper I always draw on. Tracing paper, Strathmore. It's lightweight, semi-translucent. That's my drawing paper of choice. Anyway, then I draw it traditionally. Another demo I may show how I go about all of that. But at this point we're assuming my sketch is done and approved, and it's time to go to the painting stage. So after I've got my sketch and it's approved, then I put it in my scanner. And I have a large format scanner, a UMax PowerLook 2100 XL. And I actually like it better than Epson scanners for paintings. It doesn't give me the glares that Epson's used to. I actually really like this one. So I would put my drawing in here, scan it, and then get it to my computer, at which time then I print it over here to my Epson. I do like Epson printers, and this is an old one. For Christmas, I wish I could get the big one that's even a larger format. The biggest this does is 13 by 19, and it's an archival printer, which is very awesome, and I'll show you why in a second. This is the old one, the Epson Stylus Photo 2200. My paper of choice for printing to paint on top of is this kind, the Velvet Fine Art paper, Epson. All of this is archival ink and archival paper. This is really nice and thick stuff. Has a nice watercolory texture. Okay, now we have the sketch printed out on the velvet watercolor paper, and now I do what's called wet stretching. Same process you do if you're a watercolor person. You wet your paper, soak it, and then lay it down, staple it to a board. I do this, I used to work on heavy stuff like masonite or cold press illustration board, and I just found that it was so thick and heavy when I traveled to shows. My suitcases weigh way too much. So now I just paint on thin stuff, paint it and cut it off, and that's how heavy my original art is now. Okay, so now we bring it into a large sink, and here's the neat thing about archival printers. Most of you know if you have a regular inkjet, if you sneeze on it or drool on it or something, it'll just run like crazy. So now watch this. You dip this in. You try this with your inkjet at home and you'll see a big difference. There's not a single bit of running going on there. Anyway, so that's why that's one of the reasons the archival printer works great. The pigment-based ink just sits still even when water gets on it. So I soak it in here usually for, I don't know, around 3 or 4 minutes. Okay, and after it's good and soaked, then I take it over here, and this is actually just, what's it called, sheetrock or drywall, the stuff you make walls with. This is the one I use. I've just taped it off with duct tape so the powdery stuff doesn't get on my pants or whatever. So this is the one I use. You just lay it on here. You want to print it so your border has enough extra room for staples. I like the sheetrock rather than wood because you can use a regular stapler rather than a big old staple gun like this. I used to do this, but I realized this was easier. And then you just go along and staple it. It's really easy. And The reason for wet stretching is, you know, when your paper gets wet, it warps and buckles, and so if you wet your paper and then staple it into your surface while it's wet, then when it dries it's nice and tight. And if my media is a little bit wet to begin with, it's more like watercolor in the beginning, only I use acrylic. So when you work really wet, you want it to be wet stretched so you don't have a big old warpy mess going on. Okay, if you're in a hurry to paint like I usually am, since the paper's wet, you can take the hair dryer, which is one of my best friends. It speeds everything up. You can just air dry it on hot until it's dry to the touch, or you can just let it sit till it dries out, but that takes a couple hours. Then I always tape it off, because at Art Center, white borders were a big deal to us. We always like our clean white borders. So this is just like painter's tape you can get at Home Depot. There's also a drafting tape called 230 drafting tape, which I actually like better. It's not this atrocious looking blue color, but this stuff works fine. And then I just tape it off like this. And it's almost ready to start slinging paint on. Just like that. And if you want your corners not to bleed under, you've got to burnish the little corner edges. And that's ready to go. Now I would take this over here and put it on my easel and sit down and start going. That's how I start my pieces.